Ethan Ward never imagined that the moment he needed love the most would become the moment everything he believed about loyalty shattered. And as he lay in the sterile brightness of St. Helena Memorial with an oxygen tube taped beneath his nose, he kept replaying the morning his chest had tightened so violently he collapsed on the asphalt outside his office. Because back then his only fear had been his own heartbeat giving out, not the woman waiting at home betraying him in ways he couldn't yet fathom. And while nurses drifted past his door and monitors pulsed like a ticking clock, he reassured himself that Madison, his wife of 6 years, would be at his bedside any minute. Though she still hadn't arrived despite her promise to rush over the second she heard he'd been admitted. And he tried to rationalize the absence by remembering she had always been frantic in emergencies. The type to panic, lose her shoes, forget her keys. But beneath that comforting lie was a darker pulse, something he'd ignored for months. Tiny inconsistencies like her sudden late-night gym sessions despite never owning workout clothes, or the way she clutched her phone to her chest when he walked into a room. But he was too exhausted to think deeply. And when the cardiologist told him he'd had a near heart attack from severe stress and needed monitoring for a few days, he nodded, relieved to still be breathing, grateful he could still hold Madison once she arrived. Though each hour that passed without her made the hospital walls feel tighter and colder and lonelier until finally, after 4 hours of silence, he texted her again only to see the message hang unsent before the little read indicator flickered on with no reply. And as dusk settled beyond the blinds, he drifted into a restless half-sleep haunted by dreams of alarms and footsteps until a late-night nurse gently woke him to take blood pressure readings, and he noticed his phone lighting up with a single message from Madison that said she was busy, dealing with something important and would come tomorrow. A phrase so eerily vague he stared at it for minutes, feeling an unsettling jolt beneath his ribs, because Madison had never been vague. She overshared everything from grocery receipts to her co-workers' obnoxious perfume. Yet this message felt rehearsed, clipped, almost cold. And though he tried to reach her again, she didn't respond. Not the rest of the night. Not even when he called twice and listened to the dry ring echo into voicemail. And the next morning when his sister Harper visited, she noticed immediately that his eyes kept darting to the door. And though he tried to brush it off, she eventually left to grab coffee, promising to stay close. And as she walked away, Ethan overheard two nurses whispering near the curtain about someone in the parking lot having caused a scene that morning. Something about a couple arguing loudly. But when they noticed him listening, they abruptly hushed, making him uneasy for reasons he couldn't explain. And by the time lunchtime passed with still no sign of Madison, the uneasiness had begun curdling into dread. And he kept scrolling through their messages, studying the gradual shift in her tone over the last 3 months. Remembering how she'd started avoiding physical affection, how she'd hidden her bank statements, how she'd claimed she needed space to think, all of which he had chalked up to his long work hours and his inability to relax. But now, lying there with fur lines snaking into his arm, he wondered whether she had already emotionally checked out long before the hospital machines forced him to sit still for the first time in years. And he began noticing details he had missed at home, like the faint cologne on her hoodie last week, a scent too musky to belong to any of her co-workers, or how her voicemail greeting had been re-recorded recently in a suspiciously upbeat tone. Small things that poked at him like needles, and he told himself he needed to rest. That catastrophizing wouldn't heal his heart. But when a notification buzzed on his phone and he saw a charge from a local boutique hotel timestamped 2 hours earlier under Madison's debit card, his own heart seemed to stop again. Because Madison hated hotels, hated spending money anywhere that wasn't practical. Yet there it was, a receipt clear as day. And the moment he saw it, something inside him cracked open, releasing a flood of suspicion he could no longer ignore. And though he was too weak to stand, he immediately tried calling her, only to have it go straight to voicemail again. And he lay there trembling, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the woman he trusted with his life was right now lying in a hotel bed with someone else while he lay alone fighting for breath. And as that thought consumed him, he pressed the nurse call button, asking if someone could help him contact his sister, because he needed someone outside his own spiraling mind to tell him whether he was imagining everything or whether the truth he feared was the truth unfolding in real time. And when Harper picked up on the second ring and heard the strain in his voice, she rushed back, demanding to know what had happened. and he silently showed her the hotel charge, watching the concern in her eyes congeal into something sharper, something protective, and she whispered that she would go check, that he needed to stay in bed and not work himself into another cardiac episode. And though he hated the idea of her investigating his marriage, he knew deep down he wouldn't survive discovering the truth alone. And as she left the room, something inside him knew that whatever she found at that hotel would change everything. Because Madison wasn't answering because she couldn't. Not without revealing what she'd hoped he would never learn. And as he stared at the monitor beeping beside him, he realized with chilling clarity that the hospital wasn't the only place his heart had broken this week. Harper drove to the boutique hotel with a speed that bordered on reckless despite the gray drizzle streaking the windshield. Because while she didn't want to believe her brother's worst fears, the look in Ethan's eyes at the hospital had been hollow enough to terrify her, and the sickening possibility that Madison was betraying him while he lay hooked to machines made her chest tighten with anger she hadn't felt in years. And when she pulled into the small parking lot, she noticed a familiar silver SUV parked crookedly near the back. The same one Madison drove, only now it had a jacket tossed on the dashboard and a coffee cup in the holder, signs of someone arriving in a hurry. And Harper swallowed hard before stepping inside the lobby, where a young receptionist barely looked up as she asked whether a guest named Madison Ward had checked in, but he quickly stiffened, saying he couldn't share guest details, though his eyes flickered nervously toward the corridor leading to the rooms. And Harper, who had worked in customer service long enough to recognize panic in a person's face, realized there was only one reason he'd react that way. So she simply asked whether there was a complaint earlier that morning about loud arguing, to which he hesitated before whispering that a couple had been fighting in the hallway around 10 a.m. The woman crying, the man trying to usher her back into a room. And Harper thanked him before walking slowly down the hallway carpet that muffled her steps as she approached room 214. The number matching the hotel charge Ethan had shown her, and her pulse thundered in her ears as she lifted her hand to knock. But before her knuckles touched the door, it opened slightly from inside and a man's voice murmured something she couldn't make out, causing her to jerk backward, heart slamming as the door cracked open wider to reveal a tall man she recognized instantly: Cameron Hale, a co-worker of Madison's whom Ethan had always found friendly, though Madison had brushed it off and claimed Cameron was just a harmless overachiever. But now Cameron stood there in a wrinkled t-shirt and sweatpants, hair messy in a way that could only come from sleep or something more intimate. And Harper froze as he blinked at her in shock before trying to close the door. But she shoved it open with a force she didn't know she had and stepped inside just far enough to see the room behind him, where Madison stood near the unmade bed wearing leggings and a hoodie that didn't belong to her, crying so hard she looked almost unrecognizable. And when she saw Harper, she let out a fractured sound, covering her face as Cameron cursed under his breath, demanding to know what Harper was doing there. But Harper ignored him completely, because the truth she feared had just solidified into something sharp and undeniable, and she could barely breathe. As she asked Madison how she could possibly be here while her husband lay in a hospital bed recovering from a heart episode, and Madison broke down harder, insisting she didn't plan for any of this, that she didn't know how to end things, that she'd made a mistake months ago and had tried to stop but Cameron needed her. Words that made Harper's stomach twist in disgust. But before she could say anything else, Cameron stepped closer as if to defend Madison, insisting that Ethan had been emotionally unavailable for months, claiming Madison felt neglected. But Harper exploded at that, reminding him Ethan worked himself nearly into the grave to support their life. And the very idea of blaming a near-heart attack victim for his wife cheating made Harper's voice shake with fury. And when Madison pleaded that she was planning to tell Ethan eventually, Harper snapped that eventually wasn't good enough. Not when Ethan thought she was coming to the hospital any minute. Not when he had spent 2 days believing she was simply scared or overwhelmed. And Madison's guilt showed plainly as she trembled, reaching for Harper's hand. But Harper pulled away, saying she needed to leave before she said something unforgivable, because dragging Madison out by the hair was a temptation she had to physically restrain herself from acting on. And as Harper turned to go, she warned them both that if they didn't tell Ethan the truth within the next few hours, she would. And Cameron muttered something under his breath, something about how Ethan wouldn't understand, and Harper shot him a glare that made him step back, because there was no universe in which a cheating coworker got to frame himself as the victim. Not when her brother lay in a hospital room staring at the ceiling wondering why his wife didn't love him anymore. And as Harper reached the car, she was shaking with rage, pausing only to take several breaths before driving back to St. Helena Memorial, rehearsing what she would say, trying to soften it, but realizing nothing about this would ever be soft enough to avoid breaking Ethan's heart. And she hated Madison for putting her in this position, for forcing her to be the bearer of the kind of truth that scarred people for life. And when she arrived at the hospital, she found Ethan awake, staring anxiously at the door like a man expecting either salvation or devastation. And the moment their eyes met, he could tell she knew something, because his body tensed beneath the blankets and his jaw clenched like he was bracing for impact. And Harper wished she could lie, wished she could protect him for just a little longer. But the weight of the truth pressed down on her chest until she finally told him everything she had seen inside room 214. Every detail except the parts that might kill him faster than his illness. And as she spoke, Ethan didn't blink, didn't even move, his expression flattening into something cold and lifeless, like a man who had just watched his entire reality crumble in slow motion. And when she finished, he whispered a sound that didn't resemble any word, something like disbelief mixed with heartbreak. And his hand trembled so violently she had to grip it to steady him, afraid his heart monitor would start beeping again. But he remained silent for so long that Harper wondered if she should call a nurse. Until finally he asked her in a voice barely above a breath whether Madison had looked sorry. And Harper didn't know how to answer, because Madison had looked guilty. Yes, but sorry was something else entirely. And she could not lie now, not when Ethan's world had been ripped apart. So she shook her head slowly, and Ethan closed his eyes, as if that single detail hurt more than the rest. And when he opened them again, there was something new inside them, something dark and resolved. And Harper realized this wasn't the end of the story, not even close. Because betrayal at this scale didn't simply reveal the truth, it awakened something inside a person. And Ethan was no longer just a man recovering from a near heart attack. He was a man who had been broken open, and someone like that either shatters completely or rises with a sharpness no one expects. Ethan spent the next 24 hours in the hospital, drifting in and out of a numbness so deep it felt like anesthesia had been pumped into his thoughts. And every time he opened his eyes, he half expected to see Madison walk in apologizing, sobbing, begging for forgiveness, because part of him still clung to the version of her he had built in his mind over 6 years of marriage, the caring, supportive woman who used to pack him lunches and leave handwritten notes in his coat pocket. But that version seemed like a stranger now, someone who had existed only long enough for him to trust her completely before she carved out pieces of his heart and handed them to another man. And the more he thought about the hotel room and Cameron's presence, the more he realized how many warning signs he had brushed aside. Moments when Madison had been emotionally checked out while he fought through panic attacks and spiraling stress at work. And he wondered whether she had started seeing Cameron long before she claimed, maybe even before his health began to decline, which made the betrayal feel less like a mistake and more like a pattern. But no matter how much he tried to rationalize or reframe it, nothing softened the ache that pulsed through his chest each time he remembered she was with someone else while he fought to stay alive. And by the second morning, the cardiologist told him he could be discharged as long as he avoided stress, which would have been laughable if it weren't so tragic, because the stress waiting for him outside the hospital wasn't something any medication could manage. And when Harper helped him gather his things, she kept hovering, asking if he wanted her to stay at his house for a few days. But Ethan shook his head, saying he needed to handle this himself, though deep down he wasn't sure what handling meant anymore. And when they pulled up to the small blue house he and Madison had bought 3 years earlier, Ethan felt his stomach twist into knots, because the home that once felt warm and full of shared memories now resembled a battlefield he was about to walk into without armor. And as Harper helped him out of the car, he could see Madison's silhouette through the living room window, pacing, wringing her hands, rehearsing some kind of speech. And the sight of her moving so nervously made a swell of conflicting emotions crash together inside him: anger, grief, nostalgia, resentment, disbelief. And by the time he walked through the front door, the air felt thick enough to choke on. And Madison turned sharply when she saw him, eyes swollen, face splotchy, looking more like a ghost than the woman he married. and for several long seconds they simply stared at each other, neither speaking. The silence between them so loaded it seemed dangerous to break. And when Madison finally whispered his name, he held up a hand, not wanting to hear apologies or excuses, because words felt cheap now, meaningless, flimsy compared to the magnitude of what she'd done. And he asked her one question, the only question that mattered at that moment: how long had it been going on? And Madison swallowed hard before admitting that it had started nearly 5 months ago. Something that hit Ethan like a physical blow, because 5 months earlier had been around the same time he'd told her he was feeling unusually fatigued and dizzy. And instead of helping him figure out what was wrong, she had been slipping away into someone else's arms. And though she insisted she hadn't meant to fall into an affair, that she had felt lonely and overwhelmed by Ethan's long hours, he noticed her reasoning kept circling back to how insane she felt rather than the damage she had done. And the lack of real accountability made his anger simmer until it felt like a burning coal lodged in his chest. But he forced himself to stay calm because he knew another spike in blood pressure could send him right back to the hospital. So he told her he wasn't interested in excuses, only the truth, and asked whether she had ever planned to tell him. And Madison admitted she wasn't sure, that she had been waiting for the right moment. A phrase that made Ethan laugh bitterly, because there was never a right moment to admit you destroyed your marriage while your spouse slowly fell apart. And before he could stop himself, he asked the question he dreaded the most: did she love Cameron? And the pause that followed was so long and so heavy it felt like time stopped. Until finally she whispered that she didn't know, that she thought she did at one point but now wasn't sure of anything. And that uncertainty felt worse than if she had simply said yes, because it meant she had risked their entire life together for something she wasn't even certain she wanted. And Ethan felt his heart pound harder as he realized how deeply he had misjudged the woman he had chosen as his partner. And though Madison begged him to consider therapy, to try reconciliation, he couldn't bring himself to respond, because the thought of rebuilding trust with someone who had lied so effortlessly made his throat close. So he told her he needed space, real space, not the kind she fabricated to hide secrets. And he packed a single duffel bag with clothes while Madison sobbed into her hands on the couch, though he noticed she didn't try to stop him, which told him everything he needed to know about where her heart truly was. And Harper, who had been waiting outside in her car in case things escalated, rushed to help him once he stepped back outside. But he waved her off gently and said he needed to do something alone before heading anywhere. And as she nodded reluctantly, Ethan got into his car, hands trembling on the steering wheel, not from fear but from the cold clarity settling into him like frost. Because he realized there was one part of this story he still didn't understand: Cameron's role in it all, and he couldn't move forward without confronting the man whose involvement had detonated his life. So he drove to the office building where Cameron worked, arriving earlier than most employees, the parking lot still nearly empty, and he sat in the car waiting, breathing slowly, staring at the entrance as if expecting the answers to walk out on their own. And after 20 minutes, Cameron emerged, carrying a laptop bag and a coffee, looking completely unbothered, completely normal, which made Ethan's skin crawl, because his world had collapsed while Cameron's routine continued without disruption. And Ethan stepped out of his car, walking toward him, ignoring the dull ache flaring in his chest with each step. And when Cameron finally noticed him, his eyes widened in uncomfortable recognition, and for a brief moment Ethan wondered if confronting him was a mistake. But the rage that had been simmering all night surged to the surface, overpowering any hesitation, and he realized this wasn't just about infidelity anymore. It was about reclaiming something he had lost: his voice, his dignity, his control over a life that had been quietly slipping from him long before the hospital monitors ever beeped. Cameron froze when Ethan approached, clutching his coffee cup like a flimsy shield, his eyes darting toward the building entrance, as if calculating an escape route. But Ethan kept walking until they stood only a few feet apart, the early morning air sharp enough to sting his lungs, and for a second neither man spoke. The tension stretched so tightly that even the hum of distant traffic sounded muffled. And when Cameron finally muttered Ethan's name with a reluctant greeting, Ethan stared at him with a steadiness he didn't know he could manage, considering the violent pounding in his chest. and told him he wasn't there to cause a scene but to get answers because he deserved at least that much after the hell of the past few days. And Cameron shifted uneasily, claiming Madison had already explained everything. But Ethan cut him off, reminding him that Madison had explained her version, not his, and he needed to hear the reality from the man who had knowingly stepped into a marriage with full awareness that Ethan's health was deteriorating. And Cameron's expression flickered with something like guilt before he tried to defend himself, saying he and Madison hadn't meant for anything to happen, that it started as emotional support and gradually developed. But those words made Ethan grit his teeth, because emotional support was what his spouse was supposed to receive, not outsourced to someone waiting for an opportunity. And he demanded to know whether Cameron had encouraged her to leave the marriage, and while Cameron denied pressuring her, admitting instead that Madison shared how overwhelmed she felt. His voice wavered when he insisted he didn't take advantage of her vulnerability. But Ethan could hear the cracks in that claim, the hesitation that suggested otherwise, and something in Cameron's posture slight, unsure, almost trembling triggered a new realization in Ethan's mind, a revelation forming like an unwelcome storm cloud. Because Cameron didn't look like a man who had merely crossed a line. He looked like someone hiding something deeper, something that extended beyond an affair, and the thought made Ethan's breath catch. So he asked one more question, one that had been twisting in his mind since he left the hospital. Had Cameron been with Madison in that hotel only once, or had it been a regular arrangement? And the silence that followed was damning because Cameron looked away, jaw tightening, before admitting quietly that it wasn't the first time. And the sickening truth hit Ethan like a sledgehammer, not because he hadn't suspected, but because hearing it confirmed how long he had been living in a reality he didn't recognize. And suddenly the weight of the conversation became too heavy, the ground beneath him seeming to tilt as his heart thudded hard enough to make his vision blur. And Cameron reached out instinctively as if to steady him, but Ethan stepped back, refusing his touch, and told him he didn't want or need anything from him anymore because he had all the answers that mattered. And the last thing he said before walking away was that both he and Madison had lost their chance to hurt him again. And he meant it, because something inside him shifted at that moment, a cold finality settling into place like cement drying around his resolve. And he returned to his car without looking back, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened while trying to breathe through the lingering adrenaline, telling himself to stay calm because a second hospital stay wasn't an option. Not now, not when he had decisions to make and a life to rebuild. And after several minutes he drove to Harper's house because she had offered him her guest room, and despite his insistence that he was fine on his own, he realized he wasn't ready to be completely alone in the aftermath. And when she opened the door and saw the exhaustion in his eyes, she didn't say a word, simply ushered him inside with the quiet understanding only siblings shared. And for the next few hours, Ethan lay in the guest room staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Unable to cry, unable to think straight, because the betrayals kept replaying in fragments. Madison in the hotel room, Cameron's hesitation, the lies he had accepted as truth for months, and somewhere between those spiraling thoughts he noticed a pattern he had brushed off earlier. Something Harper had mentioned about the receptionist's reaction at the hotel, something about arguing in the hallway and Cameron trying to pull Madison into the room. And the more he replayed it, the more he realized the argument couldn't have been about him, because Madison had known Harper would show up, meaning she and Cameron were fighting about something else that morning, something they didn't want overheard. And the sudden urge to dig deeper crawled through his mind like an itch he couldn't ignore. And though exhaustion weighed heavily on his body, he grabbed his phone and opened Madison's call log through their shared phone account, something he hadn't even remembered they had until that moment. And his breath hitched when he saw a number repeatedly dialed during the past 2 weeks, a number he didn't recognize, contacted late at night or early morning, times that didn't match her supposed work schedule or the timeline of the affair as she described it. And despite nausea churning in his stomach, he tapped the number into a search engine. And what came up made his heart stutter: a listing for a private clinic across town, one known for services requiring confidentiality. And Ethan stared at the screen in disbelief, because nothing in his mind linked Madison to that clinic. She had no medical issues he knew of, no reason to visit repeatedly behind his back, and the appointment times aligned eerily with days she claimed to be working late or visiting a friend. and a cold dread settled deep in his chest as he realized the affair might not have been the only secret she was hiding. Maybe not even the biggest one. And he knew he needed to confront her again, not about the betrayal he already understood, but about this new dark corner she had kept from him. And though Harper told him to rest, to recover, to give his heart a break, he couldn't stop the cascade of dread that urged him to find answers now, because he felt in his bones that whatever Madison was hiding was something he wasn't prepared for, something that would make everything else feel small in comparison. And as he stared at the private clinic's name glowing on his phone screen, Ethan felt a cold shift in the story he thought he already understood. Because Madison hadn't just betrayed him while he lay helpless in a hospital bed, she had been building a second life in the shadows long before his heart ever gave out. And he wasn't sure whether uncovering the rest of the truth would save him or finally shatter what little remained of him. Ethan didn't sleep the entire night, lying awake in Harper's guest room with the glow of his phone burning into his eyes, as the name of the private clinic looped through his thoughts like a warning he couldn't decode. And by sunrise he felt a raw urgency vibrating in him, something deeper than anger, something primal pushing him forward. And despite Harper's concern when she found him already dressed and pale, he reassured her that confronting Madison one last time wasn't about saving the marriage anymore, but about reclaiming the truth she had stolen from him. Because everything he had suffered, his failing health, the affair, the collapse of their home, felt suspiciously interconnected now. And if Madison had been keeping secrets involving a clinic known for discreet services, then the puzzle wasn't complete yet. And he refused to let her walk away with the last piece. So he drove to the house they had once shared, heart pounding with a mix of dread and clarity. And when Madison opened the door, her eyes red and swollen, she looked startled to see him, almost frightened, which only confirmed to Ethan that she knew the conversation was about to wander into territory she had avoided for months. And without stepping inside, he asked her straight out about the clinic, watching as the blood drained from her face, her breathing hitching before she whispered his name like a plea. But he didn't let her stall, pressing again with the question of why she had been going there repeatedly. And she sank down onto the edge of the couch as if her knees had buckled, burying her face in her hands before admitting she had been too afraid to tell him the truth, that she had been considering ending the marriage months before the affair ever started. And the clinic wasn't about her health at all, it was about consultations with a lawyer who specialized in discreet marital separations, the kind used by clients wanting to avoid public records during the planning stages. And Ethan felt something inside him snap, not angrily but quietly, like the final brittle thread that had been holding a memory in place. Because she hadn't stayed distant due to his illness or their rough patch, she had already emotionally checked out while he was still fighting to keep their life stable. And the affair with Cameron hadn't been a slip or a moment of weakness. It had been a byproduct of a choice she made months earlier to start detaching from him. And he asked her why she didn't just say she wanted to leave, why she didn't give him the decency of honesty instead of pretending their marriage was fine while preparing for the exit behind his back. And Madison looked at him with hollow eyes, explaining that she had been terrified of hurting him, terrified of being the bad guy, terrified of the financial mess a divorce would create if done publicly. And she admitted that when Ethan's health began declining, she felt trapped because she couldn't in good conscience leave a sick man. But she also didn't want to stay, so she let herself drift emotionally. And Cameron became an outlet for all the resentment she didn't want to deal with. And hearing those words felt like emotional whiplash, because the woman who once promised him patience and loyalty hadn't even fought for their marriage when it mattered. And Ethan realized he had been holding on to memories of her, not the reality of who she had become. And with a calmness that surprised him, he told her that while he appreciated the clarity, the damage was beyond repair, that the marriage was over in all the ways that mattered long before he ended up in the hospital. And Madison broke into quiet sobs, insisting she hadn't wanted things to fall apart like this. But Ethan recognized that her tears were no longer his responsibility to soothe, and he stood there in the living room that once felt like a sanctuary for both of them, understanding suddenly that he wasn't losing anything today, he was confirming what had already been gone. And with that final clarity, he told her he would be filing for divorce immediately, not secretly, not quietly, but openly and without shame, because he had nothing to hide. and when he left the house for the last time, the weight on his chest felt strangely lighter, as though acknowledging the death of the relationship had freed him from the slow, suffocating grief he had been living in for months. And as he drove back to Harper's, the air outside the car window seemed sharper, the colors brighter, the world less suffocating. And for the first time since waking up in the hospital bed, Ethan allowed himself to breathe without feeling guilt or fear. And over the next few weeks, he began rebuilding, leaning on Harper's unwavering support, attending cardiac follow-ups, joining a support group recommended by his doctor, and learning to separate his self-worth from the betrayal that had tried to define him. And though Madison sent long messages about wanting closure or understanding, he kept boundaries firm, responding only with practical details when necessary. And slowly, painfully, the pieces of his life began to align again. Not perfectly, but steadily. And 6 months later, he finalized the divorce, signing the papers with a steady hand and a silent acknowledgement that the man who once walked into a hospital as a broken husband had emerged from it as someone stronger, wiser, and more self-aware. And though the wounds hadn't fully healed, they no longer controlled him. And when he walked out of the courthouse into the summer air, he realized he had survived not just heart failure, but emotional collapse. And in doing so, he had reclaimed not only his life, but the future Madison tried to discard. And his story, messy, painful, and deeply human, became one he chose to share not as a victim, but as a reminder that even the deepest betrayals can become the starting point of a new life. One built not on illusion or fear, but on truth.